The Department of International Relations has slammed a U.S. human rights report as inaccurate and deeply flawed. In its annual report, the U.S. State Department says human rights in South Africa have worsened significantly. It criticized the country's Land Expropriation Act, raised concerns about alleged extrajudicial killings and alleged repression of racial minorities. For more on this, we're joined by our U.S. correspondent, Simon Marks. A very good afternoon to you, South African time. That is Simon. Thanks very much for your time. What is going on? Talk us through how this report was compiled and by whom.
So I think it's important to underscore, Vuyo, that this is going to go down in the annals of American history. This is an annual State Department review that is published every year by successive presidents for decades into the state of human rights around the world. And presidents in the past have been accused of using it to knock countries that they are particularly concerned with or hostile towards. There's often, for example, enormous debate about what the Human Rights Report has to say about what is taking place in various parts of the Middle East, or what it has to say about what's taking place in Cuba. But there has never been any kind of suggestion that South Africa would be in the spotlight until this year. And you've got to wonder what historians in generations to come are going to make about the text in this report that relates to South Africa, repeating so many of the concerns that the South African government has dismissed as false, that were articulated by President Trump during that very contentious Oval Office meeting with President Cyril Ramaphosa a few months ago, underscoring that the United States government believes that extrajudicial killings are taking place in South Africa. However, in one area, and I think one area alone, there is a distinction between what President Trump and his Secretary of State Marco Rubio have been saying and the language that is used in this report, because they have been articulating the view that Afrikaner farms are being expropriated under the Expropriation Act, and that white Afrikaner farmers are being stripped of their livelihoods in the active present tense. It is happening. It has happened. Of course, the South African government points out it hasn't happened, even though the Expropriation Act contains the potential for it one day to happen. It has not, as President Trump and Marco Rubio insist, it has not occurred. And so the language that's used in this report about expropriation is interesting because it says the act could enable the government to seize ethnic minority Afrikaners' agricultural property without compensation. It says that that would be government action that could fuel disproportionate violence against racially disfavored landowners. But it's important to emphasize they put it in the report in the conditional tense. It hasn't happened. It could happen. It might happen. That's in stark contrast to what Donald Trump and Marco Rubio have themselves personally said that it is happening. So inasmuch as there is any chink of daylight for the South African government in this report, it might be contained in that paragraph.
I guess it is precisely because at that meeting between Presidents Trump and Ramaphosa, the South African delegation sought to clear the air and set the record straight, and even went further to invite the President of the United States of America and his team to actually seek more information, which they will be provided if they did ask for it, in case things were still unclear. And I guess it is with that in mind that the Minister of International Relations has since expressed his profound disappointment that such a deeply flawed account of what is happening in South Africa, such a distortion, fundamental distortion of facts, some of the words being used are in fact going to go unchallenged, and they have been put out there in the public domain as facts or something very close to facts. One wonders what this is going to mean for the relationship between the two nations, especially as the two countries are busy negotiating a trade deal, but also talking about the tariffs that the United States of America has imposed.
Yeah, I think it's worth questioning just how busy the two countries are on that trade deal. I mean, certainly the South African side is busy submitting fresh proposals to the United States government to try and alleviate some of that tariff burden. But there is no particular evidence that the US government is especially busy working to respond to South Africa's overtures. And more broadly, it is absolutely apparent now that in terms of the bilateral relationship with South Africa, but also in terms of a whole host of other policy areas, the administration in this city, the Trump administration, is set only to transmit, not to receive. So put the South African quandary into a broader context. Washington, D.C. today, the streets of the center of the city are teeming with National Guard, armored personnel carriers taking up positions along many of the main thoroughfares of this city, based on a wholly false narrative advanced by President Trump earlier this week that there is a monumental crime wave that has reduced this city to complete and total lawlessness, a claim that flies in the face of crime statistics that show violent crime at a 30-year low point. There are other areas where policies are being made up based out of whole cloth. The Bureau of Labor Statistics jobs numbers rejected by the Trump administration because the president didn't like the message that they delivered, so he fired the chief of the bureau in charge of gathering those statistics. We learned yesterday that the Smithsonian museums that line the center of this city are having all of their exhibits reviewed by the White House to ensure that they align with Donald Trump's interpretation of history. That's literally what the White House has said about this review of every single exhibit within every single Smithsonian institution. So South Africa, trying to push back against a false narrative about what is taking place within South Africa, is honestly just another shrimp on the barbecue at this point for the Trump administration. And I think frustrating as it must be for President Ramaphosa and government officials and lawmakers there, the reality is they are going to struggle to push back against this narrative, to turn President Trump around, get him to agree to attend the G20 summit in South Africa in November. He says he's probably not going to be there because this is an administration that really isn't listening, it's only transmitting.
I guess South Africa is not alone then. Before I let you go, Simon, in a couple of days, President Trump is scheduled to meet the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And in the past week, President Ramaphosa has held telephonic discussions with both presidents. What can we expect?
Well, this summit meeting is going to be taking place at a US Air Force base in Alaska, which is absolutely extraordinary given the fact that Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump's honored guest, is sanctioned to the hilt by the United States and, of course, is wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. No risk that the United States is going to apprehend him, of course, because they don't recognize the International Criminal Court. The concern that Ukraine and its European allies have is that President Trump is going to be wooed by Vladimir Putin into dismembering Ukraine against the wishes of Ukraine and its European allies in exchange for an economic cooperation agreement with Russia. And President Trump was musing at the White House earlier this week about what wonderful opportunities apparently exist for American companies in Russia if only Vladimir Putin would step back from the path of war and embrace the path of economic development. So that's certainly where the president's head is going into this meeting. Critics of the White House say it is a massive concession, even to allow Vladimir Putin to set foot on American soil. He hasn't visited the United States in a decade. But the president's supporters say, look, this is a listening exercise. Donald Trump wants to look Vladimir Putin in the eye and get the measure of his interlocutor so he can make a final decision about whether there is any prospect for a peace agreement in Ukraine, or whether, as he has previously said, he suspects that Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace and is simply tapping him along. That's how President Trump described things back in April. So it's an all-important meeting. Both men, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, of course, have communicated with President Ramaphosa in the last few days. And that does give President Ramaphosa an interesting position in all of this, as someone who is talking to both men. Whether he can capitalize on that in any way after this summit meeting and use it potentially as an advantage as he tries to rebuild the bilateral relationship with the United States, I think is a very open question.
Quickly, Simon, no sign that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, may just join the meeting at some point.
None at all. I mean, that would be a stunning surprise were it to occur. President Trump says he's not being invited. He's been at the table for 3.5 years, says President Trump. He hasn't achieved anything. He now wants to talk face-to-face with Putin. Then he's going to call Zelensky after the meeting. And the Americans are still hoping to broker a 2- or 3-way conversation between Putin and Zelensky that Trump might be in the middle of, but it's certainly not going to take place in Alaska on Friday.
Simon Marks, thank you very much for that contribution. He is, of course, our U.S. correspondent.